talk about a democratized future of medical device R&D and what that means at the point of care. You may have this, and some of you may work in environments like this where medical devices are being made all around the world. They're saving patients' lives. I spend most of my time working with medical devices that are made and modified and hacked in environments like this with some of the most innovative and creative people in healthcare. One of the first nurses that I worked with is Daniela Urbina in Esteli, Nicaragua. While the director of the hospital was taking us on a tour to see the brand new donated ventilator, we looked in the back and saw these hand-cut custom eyeglasses being made by the nursing team, covering the very delicate small patients. At that moment, we knew nurses are the hackers of the hospital supply closet, and they are solving problems that we can't otherwise even begin to think of. How to get a supply chain of neonate bilirubin eye protectors down there. They've just solved it. And so we call them maker nurses. In 2013, we brought this program to the United States with support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And Exponential Medicine has been an incredible supporter of us. Shauna Butler was one of the first people who reached out when we launched Maker Nurse and opened it and said, we want to celebrate and bring nurse making to the forefront of healthcare. She said, that's amazing because nurses are faster than a medical device company and they're closer to the patient than an engineer ever will be. And it is so true. Those timelines and the turnaround and the feedback loops that nurses have with their patients are unlike anything else inside of our healthcare system. Some of the nurses, when we started to explore what this looked like in the US and what nurses were making and creating inside of the hospital, we met people like Nicole Wooden from the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. Nicole had made a radial arm board for the catheter lab patients using Home Depot acrylic, an old monitor tray that she found inside of the hospital hallway in a little hinged elbow. She put these together, spent about 3 months doing it, but it worked. And she was able to use it instead of stacking towels under patients' arms to support them during a very invasive procedure. They had an actual device to do it, made by a nurse, reviewed by the internal committee at the hospital. When we started meeting nurses like Nicole and talking to hospitals across the country, one of the first things we heard from the frontline nurses was, well, if you think what we're doing is amazing, you should see what's happening in other parts of the healthcare system. You should see what respiratory therapists do, what surgeons, what patients are making. And it's true. Mark Belanger is, he's a machinist at MIT up in Boston. He's also the father to Corey. Corey has a condition that requires her to have a feeding tube. She spends quite a bit of time inside of the hospital, but she's also an active 8-year-old, and she's running around everywhere. And what Mark kept realizing was that Corey would pull out her tube, or she would get antsy. She wanted to know what it was. So you can see up here, he iterated through multiple different ways to try to solve this problem, from Easter eggs to 3D printing to injection molding. But because he was there with Corey, he knew best how to design this, how to create this, what it should look like. And this isn't new. The notion that people who are using medical devices would make them is not new at all. In 1953, the heart-lung machine was built by John Haitian Gibbons. And when he couldn't get it commercialized, he couldn't get it licensed, he actually shared the blueprints with the world. He kept sending it to his colleagues to say, I think you'll benefit from this. In nurses, from 1900 up until the late 1970s, had an entire publication dedicated to making and sharing medical devices. And it was everything from how do you best organize and color code IV lines, to how do you evacuate all of the smallest patients inside of the hospital in case of an emergency. And they would post not only the solution itself, but how to create it. And in the 80s, that went away and was replaced in that same publication with an equipment review. But what you just solved is the nurse making didn't go away, and the making at the point of care didn't go away just because it was no longer celebrated, because solving problems by creating is in our DNA. Whether you are a parent, a patient, or working at the front lines of care, people want to proactively make solutions for those who they love and who they're treating. In 2009, this was when we really started the adventure into what does it mean to not only recognize and celebrate what is being made, but how do we support it with tools and technology in a really meaningful way. So the first work we did with the Inter-American Development Bank in Little Devices Lab at MIT was launching a curriculum of prototyping toolkits across Nicaragua to see how we could mash up the technology from our lab with local supply chains to teach how medical devices could be made. MEDIC was called Medikit, was Medical Education Design and Invention Kit, and as part of that, we had the idea, we're like, what if we installed a makerspace in Nicaragua, and what if we gave a clinical makerspace and gave people access to it? And it turned out we learned something really important, that we installed the space between a hospital and a nursing school. Right in the middle was the makerspace, and it was 100 feet too far from the hospital for it to be useful. No staff were able to go in. This was an incredibly busy hospital, and because it was out of sight, out of mind, they were just never participated in, even though all the tools were there, which to us was incredibly frustrating, because we were like, we see that you're doing all of these great things, and we want to support it and help you learn how to scale them. But we were able to take that back into what we're doing today, and I'll show a little bit more of that. So fast forward 2010 to 2017, this is what the ecosystem of health making looks like today. It includes industry, startup, academia. This is just a quick snapshot, but it gives you a sense of how thriving it is. And there are a lot of different communities and groups that are solving the problem and providing tools in really different ways. And this is what generates a movement. This is when you have different types of people sharing their ideas, sharing their methodology very openly, and advancing this forward. And so what you'll see up on the slide is there are some of the groups that have been presenting throughout the week are actually a part of what it means to bring tools to the people who best know how to solve these problems in healthcare. So with Maker Health, one of the key things that we do is bring prototyping spaces into hospitals. And here's a quick snapshot of what this looks like. There's really 3 areas that we're looking at when it comes to like how and why what does a hospital get from? Why would you put a makerspace in a hospital? It saves cost. So a lot of the workarounds and inefficiencies that you're seeing happening throughout the hospital can be standardized with tools like digital fabrication. It enhances patient care when patients can be part of the conversation about what their solution should look like or what their device should be. When they're part of, they see their care team working with them to get an N of 1 solution, they feel much better about that. And it actually builds a culture of innovation in a way that invites people to experiment with ideas and gives them a safe place to do that and allows them to learn from peers inside of the hospital that they otherwise would never see. The space, for those of you who aren't familiar with what a makerspace is, it includes tools for prototyping and creating just about anything. You'll typically see them in communities or schools, and this is the key areas that we bring into our Maker Health spaces. So slightly different because you have all of a sudden tools and materials for things like fluid management. Like you wouldn't necessarily need a UV plastic welder inside of a middle school makerspace, but it turns out that's one of the most popular tools because it allows staff to create custom tubing circuits for their patients. And the materials and tools that we brought into the Maker Health spaces are based off of the research that we did through the Maker Nurse study and then expanded and building out what is a prototyping genome. So this is the layer of tools and materials that we found were being used most often for those point of care moments of making and MacGyvering. We overlaid that with the tools and materials that we've been using inside of the lab to get what is inside of the Maker Health space today. When we were launching and running the Maker Nurse study, one of the most interesting things that we saw was this discrepancy up on the board. So the difference between the way that nurses were able to articulate ideas versus something that they could hold in their hand that they'd made. So across the bottom axis of this is all of those different tools and materials you saw in the prototyping genome. And on the top one, the orange, is when nurses were showing us something that they had made. It was a bandage, it was an assistive device for one of their patients, a feeding tube support. They were able to really walk through what exactly they used. But when nurses had an idea, you can see the sparsity on the bottom, those yellow bar lines. They rarely understood or could even think of how they would start to make this. So this gap is what is like a gap in the prototyping literacy and the technology literacy, which really was the barrier between nurses where they're currently making and prototyping inside the hospital today to what they could be doing with all of the amazing tools, everything from 3D printing to sensors that are available today. Because it is both that the tools that you saw, but it's also a mindset and this thinking and this training. So as we've been rolling out these Maker Health spaces and a network of them across the country, we've realized that we need that layer of education and training is so important. So it's really the second and most important thing that we do is once that is in place, what is the culture, what is the education, and how do we do that and bring it to the level of the person who's walking in the door who may have never seen any of this technology before in their life. And then the other layer of that is that peer learning through a global network of health makers and the platforms that support those conversations. So we've worked with Mayo Clinic to teach their nurses how to prototype solutions with patients and how to have those conversations. Inside of the Maker Health space at UTMB, nurses are working on a new labor and delivery gown that allows better skin-to-skin contact. The vascular lab team they bring their equipment down from the vascular lab and work on all of the different ways that they can modify it from organization to workflow using the tools and materials at hand. So 2 quick case studies to walk you through so you can really get a sense of what is the value at an individual level. So Dr. Soham Desai is a neurosurgeon who finished his residency at UTMB in Galveston, is now at Doctors Hospital Renaissance in McAllen, Texas. And this quote from him is amazing, and the fact that a neurosurgeon of the hospital who has been in the space working right alongside the locksmith and brainstorming how to modify their 3D prints, this is what it means to have a democratized safe space for experimentation. Courtney Del Bosque is a NICU nurse who went through the process of learning how to use a vinyl cutter so that she could actually make these custom bandages for the NICU patients instead of hand cutting them, being able to make them in about 20 minutes each month for all of their patients. And if you know in advance any of these things were going to work, it wouldn't be an experiment. And to us, that's one of the most important things that we take home and that the hospitals we're working with take home about what does it mean to have a Maker Health space. The most important stat on here is 92% of people think that these spaces are furthering their career. So when you're surrounded by staff who are otherwise burned out, that to us is incredible. And when we compare the people who are coming into the Maker Health space with other types of hospital innovation programs, you can see the diversity of staff. So while MDs and PhDs from these institutions are some of the main users, they're not the only users. So with that, I'll wrap up with a quick plug and slide, and we love to help you all move forward in different ways and to join us in making health. In addition to those hospital maker spaces that you saw, this is the global community, and they're solving the problems in really interesting ways that we would, and they're sharing them with an entire network of health makers around the world. So thank you for your time, and look forward to hearing what your ideas are and helping you make them real.
So what's been the most surprising thing you've seen hacked? And that's actually then gone into the real world.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the most expected thing is probably 3D printing, but the most surprising thing that we see are wound care bandages. So being able to treat phalloceles, which was something that I never would have thought that they would be working on. But it actually went from, went from modifying bandages that are otherwise used for sacrum pressures to now being used to treat babies with small abdominal wall defects.
If anyone here wants to create kind of their own version of a makerspace, how do they best follow up with you? Is it Anna@makerhealth.co is my email address. I'll be here the rest of the afternoon. Would love to have a conversation, but also talk offline. Great. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Daniel.